Hello and welcome to episode 276 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert as always, Damien Fay, and me, Andy Leaks. Damien, how are you doing? Welcome back.
I'm good, Andy. Good to be back on the show. We've had a lot of good reviews and feedback this week, so I'm absolutely buzzing, and I've been really looking forward actually to this particular show because we put a lot of work into it. If anybody has already seen the title of this week's episode, they'll understand why, but it's something we've been thinking about for a number of weeks, isn't it? And we wanted to do something that was meaningful and use our platform, as we've done in the past, for shining light on inequality. So what I want you to do is focus on Black economics. Now, on episode 246 of this podcast, we did a piece on feminist economics and the importance of it. And it was received really well, and we got a lot of good feedback about it. And so we wanted to do a piece about the importance of, obviously, Black economics, what's going on in the world right now, and shining a light on the inequality that exists, but also to try and educate people, because this whole movement obviously is important to everybody, in particular the Black community, but it's also important to Justin and I because we are mixed race as well. So it is another reason why we wanted to do this piece. And I mean, I've been the subject of racism in my life. I'm not going to dwell on that. This isn't about me personally. So what we're going to do is follow a thread in this podcast where we shine a light on the issues out there and hopefully start to get people to think a bit more about the problem and about the systemic issues out there and how they maybe can be rectified. So I want to start by talking about, very briefly, an article that was in the FT that was written by Kwame Nassam. Now, he is an emerging market equity trader for JP Morgan Chase, and he came to the UK from Ghana as a child. And in his piece, which is a very good piece in the FT, he talks about the issues and unconscious bias that exist in society that he's had to fight against in his career and the challenges. And there was a piece at the end, we're going to link to the piece so people can read it, but there's a paragraph at the end which I thought was very profound. And he said that while many employers, including his own, are implementing structural changes to increase representation of minority groups, but to have the desired long-lasting effect, we also need to change at the individual level. And he says the key to unlocking unconscious bias is first to listen to the experiences of Black people and acknowledge that bias exists. And then secondly, look inward and understand why it exists. And finally, begin the difficult task of mitigating its harmful effects. So what we're going to try and do on the podcast today is particularly look at those first two parts and then get people thinking about the latter. So to kick off, we're going to play you a piece of audio that came from America. Now, Kimberly Jones is an author, and she made a speech that went viral. We're going to put the full link in the show notes, and it's best always to go to the article that relates to this podcast on our website. Go to the website, click on the link at the top of the page that says podcast, and you'll find this show. And the full, I think it's about 8 minutes long, is well worth listening to, and it's incredibly powerful. But she makes an amazing analogy about Black economics and the issues facing Black Americans. So if we play that clip now.
Let me explain to you something about economics in America. And I'm so glad that as a child, I got an opportunity to spend time at Push where they taught me this, is that we must never forget that economics was the reason that Black people were brought to this country. We came to do the agricultural work in the South and the textile work in the North. Do you understand that? That's what we came to do. We came to do the agricultural work in the South and the textile work in the North. Now, if I right now decided that I wanted to play Monopoly with you, and for 400 rounds of playing Monopoly, I didn't allow you to have any money, I didn't allow you to have anything on the board, I didn't allow for you to have anything. And then we played another 50 rounds of Monopoly, and everything that you gained and you earned while you were playing that round of Monopoly was taken from you. That was Tulsa, that was Rosewood. Those are places where we built Black economic wealth, where we were self-sufficient, where we owned our stores, where we owned our property, and they burned them to the ground. So that's 450 years. So for 400 rounds of Monopoly, you don't get to play at all. Not only do you not get to play, you have to play on the behalf of the person that you're playing against. You have to play and make money and earn wealth for them, and then you have to turn it over to them. So then for 50 years, you finally get a little bit and you're allowed to play. And every time that they don't like the way that you're playing, or that you're catching up, or that you're doing something to be self-sufficient, they burn your game. They burn your cards. They burn your Monopoly money. And then finally at the release and the onset of that, they allow you to play and they say, okay, now you catch up. Now at this point, the only way you're going to catch up in the game is if the person shares the wealth, correct? But what if every time you share the wealth, then there's psychological warfare against you to say, oh, you're an equal opportunity hire. So if I played 400 rounds of Monopoly with you and I had to play and give you every dime that I made, and then for 50 years, every time that I played, if you didn't like what I did, you got to burn it like they did in Tulsa and like they did in Rosewood. How can you win? How can you win? You can't win. The game is fixed. So when they say, why do you burn down the community? Why do you burn down your own neighborhood? It's not ours. We don't own anything. We don't own anything.
So that was an incredibly powerful speech on the subject. But what I wanted to illustrate in the next section of the podcast, that this isn't just a US issue. So we want people to acknowledge and understand that there is an issue in the UK. So there was some research that was published in The Guardian, and the research was done by the University of Bristol, the University of Manchester, and the National Centre for Social Research. And they looked at the census records between 1970 and the 2000s. And they showed that the job prospects of black and other minority groups lagged behind white people in England and Wales. And it was because of persistent racism. And the conclusion was that the persistent racism has an impact on the access of minority groups to employment and the ways in which they can have access to positive socioeconomic outcomes, including social mobility. Now, social mobility is a term which effectively means that people are able to improve their situation. So I don't like using the word class, but it would mean perhaps somebody being able to go from being a low-paid worker to being a better paid worker, or for people to access towards the middle class. And that is obviously terms that have come back from legacy from years ago. But that is what social mobility effectively means. It allows people to be able to move from the position that they are currently, that they may be inherited, and to improve that situation. So ethnic minorities are already disadvantaged by that, and that is evidenced by the census. But when they drilled down in the numbers, they found that black Caribbean men were more likely to move into manual occupations than British white men. And similarly, they were more likely to be unemployed. And it depended on the ethnic groups, but it was between 1.8 to 2 times more likely to be unemployed or off work as a result of perhaps sickness when compared to their white counterparts. Now, there are a lot of social issues in there, but it starts to show that already they are disadvantaged. If we look at that in even more detail, the Telegraph actually produced some great visual representation of some of the issues that are facing black people in terms of the wealth gap. Now, we're going to link to every resource that I talk about in this podcast, so you can read more around it yourself. But if we want to look at the earnings gap that exists, now, black Africans typically will earn £10,000 less a year than their white counterparts after you take into housing costs. And that's according to the Resolution Foundation. Black Caribbeans typically earn £7,000 less, but it goes even further than that. So black men in the same occupation with the same qualifications as their white counterparts will earn between 15 and 19% less. So these are facts that can't be argued with. When you look at the numbers, there is a bias. There is a wealth gap that exists between black people and white people. So this is the economics. It's something we've got to fix. And the situation isn't improving. Now, recessions come along, and they come along periodically, but they disproportionately have impacted the black community more than the white community. So if you go back to the financial crisis, black men faced a deeper, more sustained employment fall as a result. So white men typically employment levels fell from 80% to 76%, and it lasted for 2 years. For black males, that fell from 70% employment to 63% employment, and that downturn lasted 5 years. But the situation is repeating itself in the current climate because obviously, because of the coronavirus, we are now in the midst of another downturn. And according to a study that's titled Understanding Society, which is led by academics from the Institute of Social and Economic Research, of around 4,000 workers who had lost work because of coronavirus, 21% of those from ethnic minorities said this was because they had actually lost their job, compared to just 7% of white people. Now, almost half of white workers whose hours had been cut said this was because they'd been furloughed, meaning that they were being effectively paid by the government. And so that also means theoretically they still had a job. But contrast that with less than a third of black and Asian people who have lost work have been furloughed. So we can already see that in the current crisis, then black communities are facing a tougher challenge than a white community. Now, of course, we're talking about broad statistics. I know there'll be people who will be thinking about their own individual circumstances, but we'll come on to that a bit later because there's another audio clip that I want to play people that is incredibly powerful. I first heard it a number of years ago, and it isn't directly based upon the inequality based upon race, but it is incredibly relevant. And it was something that I listened to that fueled my own desires to try and help inequality. Money to the Masses is fundamentally built upon that, trying to bring money to the masses. But what the clip does is it allows a bit of self-reflection and about where we are in life as individuals. So it'll make more sense when we come on to it. But let's take this a bit further. If we start to look at housing. Now, there was a House of Commons briefing that looked at property ownership, and less than a third of black households are owner-occupied. And that means, when I say owner-occupied, either they own it outright or they have a mortgage on it. That contrasts with 2/3 of white households who own their house either outright or via a mortgage. Now, that is important because in this country, one of the biggest ways to grow wealth is to own property. And we all know the obsession with owning property, and that fuels it. Now, sadly, the home ownership percentage is actually falling among the black community. Now, it is actually falling widely. The amount of home ownership across the country is falling. If you look at the numbers between 2001 and 2016, then the amount of home ownership has actually fallen, but it's fallen fastest in the black community compared to the white community. So it's gone from 39% ownership to 29% ownership. And 48% of black households are in social housing. So this already paints a picture of inequality that is skewed. And it also starts to highlight a systemic problem that we have. And we talk about it a lot on the podcast about empowering people to grow their own wealth. That is intrinsically wrapped up in home ownership. And if you go back to the early 80s, I remember my own family, for example, were able to buy their council house. Now, that ability to be able to buy a council house had a big impact on my own family. And I was talking to my dad the other day, and he even sort of commented about it and said he probably wouldn't even be able to ever own a house if he hadn't been able to buy the council house that we lived in at that point. And that's important because what happens is intergenerational wealth gets passed on. And so if you have a family that owns a property and they are able to build wealth and they are able then to pass it down to their children, think of it like a relay race. It enables that person, the next generation, to have a better start than the previous one. But if you don't have the ability to own property, or you weren't able to, for whatever reason financially, then that starts to be perpetuated through the generations. And the portion of society that are able to own property and to accrue wealth faster, because we do live in a capitalist society, and the term money makes money is true. And we talked about it recently on a podcast when we were talking about inflation and the importance of growing wealth. If you have wealth and you pass it on, it starts to be almost more and more concentrated in certain parts of society. Now, I mentioned that story about my parents buying their council house. And I just want to quote something from a piece in The Guardian, which talks about the housing crisis and why it's so much worse for black families. And it actually refers back to that period of being able to buy council houses. And the right to buy, I'm going to read this out loud, the right to buy boosted ownership among white working class families. But rules on council housing in the 70s and 80s tended to shut out those from ethnic minorities. And they go on to say that at the time, to get social housing, you needed to meet residential qualifications. And in a lot of local authorities, including many boroughs of London, you had to have lived there for a certain number of years to be considered for social housing. If you were a new arrival, you had very little chance. So when people from Asia and the Caribbean first came to the UK, there was tremendous discrimination. And so that fundamentally is one of the reasons why there is a problem. There are other issues of why there is a housing crisis among the black population, but it's being skewed. Now, if you think about this and you think about it more widely, you will see policies that are made in government that try and help us pass on wealth. And we had one not long ago where, when it came to inheritance tax, it was trying to give preferential terms, really, if you own property, to be able to pass on more of your property to your next of kin. Those sorts of rules, when you zoom out and look at them, they amplify the issues that already exist in the inequality, because it allows people who own property to pass it on through their family and pay less tax. Now, even if we believed that the tax that was being collected was being spent on the greater and wider good, then that means less tax is being collected in that way. But more importantly, it means that the wealth is being more and more concentrated in a particular portion of society. Now, to emphasize that, I want to talk about the wealth gap. If you can actually put numerical values on it. Now, the Office for National Statistics, I always struggle saying that word, they worked out that the average white British household has around 282,000 in wealth, including property. Now, if you look at black African households, they have less than a tenth of that on average, with the average being 23,800. Now, that means for every £1 that white households have, black African households have just 10p. For black Caribbean households, it's around 20p. So the inequality is enormous, and you can see this is systemic, and we have to make some changes to be able to improve this situation, because it's not a case of just saying to people, go and try and buy a house, because it's not easy. Now, we often hear from younger generations that they are unable to buy a house because they can't afford it. But the difficulty in saving up for a deposit is amplified if the type of jobs that you're able to get are the lower paid income jobs, as we've mentioned. I mean, if you just think about it, there's an incredible statistic. If you look at the black, Asian and minority ethnic categorization, then the percentage of workers on 0-hour contracts is 25%. If you look at the general population, it's only 14%. So black and Asian workers are more likely to be in unstable jobs with fewer rights anyway. And also they're more likely to be in the lower paid jobs, as we've already established. So it's very difficult for them to be able to build a deposit, to be able to save money, to be able to buy property anyway. And not only that, because of what we talked about in terms of social mobility, it also means that they are less likely to be able to improve that situation through no fault of their own. And if you look at where black communities end up living, they end up living often in inner cities where house prices, like in central London, are extortionate. So we've got the highest house prices, but we have this mass inequality when it comes to the earnings of a population who, as we've already described, are just as qualified but being paid less. Then how is the situation going to improve unless something is structurally done about it? And as I highlighted earlier, if the black community as a percentage own less property, that means more of them are renting. And renting, as we know, is more expensive than owning property. So again, they're already fighting an uphill battle to try and save a deposit when they're paying more for where they already live. And this is also interesting. If you're listening to this podcast, in a second, I'm going to get you to search something and you'll be amazed. Don't forget that most people get on the property ladder, the young people, because of the bank of mum and dad. Now, obviously, as I mentioned earlier about the intergenerational wealth, the bank of mum and dad is more likely to be able to pay for you if they've already been able to accrue their own wealth. If they aren't able to, as we've already established, it's already difficult for black people, or more difficult than for white people. It means they're unlikely to be helped by the bank of mum and dad. Now, get your phone out and go and Google the word bank of mum and dad and put it in Google Images. Click on the image tab. Go and do it. And this is a beautiful illustration of not only how the bank of mum and dad is perceived, but it's just the skew and bias in our media. if you scroll through the first couple of hundred results, you will keep going. See how many black people you see in those pictures. See how many people from any ethnic minority you see in there. They're almost exclusively pictures of white people, white mums, white dads with white children. This is all perpetuating the issue. And in fact, when I went through, there were only, I think, 2 images. One of those images only had the hands of the black people and not their whole faces. But it just shows you that the idea that the bank of mum and dad is disproportionately white. So again, this is the issue. So it means if we want to try and solve these problems, we're going to have to look at the inequality that already exists. So there will be people out there who are listening to this and they may be sitting there thinking, well, yeah, but everybody has it tough. And you just have to work hard to get out of these situations. In fact, they may be sitting there thinking that they are a white person and no one gave them anything on the plate and they came from humble beginnings and they worked really, really hard. Now, what I want to do, this is next clip that we're going to play. I want you to listen to carefully. It works amazingly in a visual context. We'll put the link to the video, but it is about the idea of a race and putting the idea that we are all running a race. And the audio works very well on its own as well. So just first, to give some context, because you can't see the audio clip, there is a teacher who is standing in a field and he's calling his students up to start a race. He starts to call them up and they're all just they're very mixed bunch. A lot of white children, there are Hispanics and black children. And he's calling them up because he's going to do an experiment with them and they don't know what it is. So we're going to play the audio now.
Hey, line up. Line up. Everybody line up. We're about to race. Everybody line up. Shoulder to shoulder. Take off your backpacks. Basketball. Line up. We're about to race. Hey, we are racing for a $100 bill. The winner of this race will take this. A $100 bill. Before I say go, I'm going to make a couple statements. If those statements apply to you, I want you to take 2 steps forward. If those statements don't apply to you, I want you to stay right where you're at. Take 2 steps forward if both of your parents are still married. Take 2 steps forward if you grew up with a father figure in the home. Take 2 steps forward if you had access to a private education. Take 2 steps forward if you had access to a free tutor growing up. Take 2 steps forward if you've never had to worry about your cell phone being shut off. Take 2 steps forward if you've never had to help mom or dad with the bills. Take 2 steps forward if it wasn't because of your athletic ability, you don't have to pay for college. Take 2 steps forward if you never wondered where your next meal was going to come from. I want you guys up here in the front just to turn around and look. Every statement I've made has nothing to do with anything any of you have done. Has nothing to do with decisions you've made. Everything I have said has nothing to do with what you've done. We all know these people up here have a better opportunity to win this $100. Does that mean these people back here can't race? No. We would be foolish to not realize we've been given more opportunity. We don't want to recognize that we've been given a head start. But the reality is we have. Now, there's no excuse. They still got to run their race. You still got to run your race. But whoever wins this $100, I think it'd be extremely foolish of you not to utilize that and learn more about somebody else's story. Because the reality is, if this was a fair race and everybody was back on that line, I guarantee you some of these black dudes would smoke all of you. And it's only because you have this big of a head start that you're possibly going to win this race called life. That is a picture of life, ladies and gentlemen. Nothing you've done has put you in the lead that you're in right now. When I say go, on your mark, get set, If you didn't learn anything from this activity, you're a fool.
So that was an incredibly powerful video. Do make sure you go and watch the full clip, because just to give you some context, although the original piece was just about inequality, there is fundamentally an underlying race element to it, because if you look at the video, the children in it basically become segregated, with the black children disproportionately on that starting line, but with the more privileged white counterparts already halfway to the $100 bill. So it gives us a lesson in life that we need to acknowledge our own starting points, that we've had a leg up in life, no matter how small it is. I know that some people don't like to admit it, but we have to certain points. And it fits with what we're talking about today, because in terms of black economics, the black community are starting much further back in that race for life. And the fact that they actually get to where they do in their achievements is even more impressive. As a result, you're not undervaluing what everybody's doing. Everyone's running their own race. But I think it's a brilliant example. And it's only when you can recognize the head start you've had in life, no matter how small, that you can then start to understand the inequalities that exist in the world. And it's only then that you can really believe in inequality and stand for it. So you have to be able to recognize it in ourselves and the biases that exist out there. So hopefully the first part of the podcast, we've done that. We've emphasized the inequalities, we've shown it, and then we've led people on a bit of a journey. So they've actually understood that even themselves, even if they've had a tough life themselves, and maybe they're not black, but they've actually started to understand where they are in that race for that $100 bill, that they were further ahead than other people who had a more difficult start to the race. But I want to now move on and look at the wider issues that we have within the system, because the system in finance in particular amplifies these inequalities. Now, the banking system in itself is one of the big problems, because the banking system, if we go back, was originally brought about to support the economy. That was its purpose. But as the years go by and the generations go by, the banking system has become much more about speculation. So we had investment banks. It's more about trading stocks and shares for the benefit of the few rather than the wider benefit of the economy and those people who are in it. And of course, what it does, it concentrates that wealth. It almost becomes like a club that people struggle to get into. And don't forget that it was the banking sector that caused the financial crisis of 2008. And that, as I've already talked about, disproportionately affected the black community. And so if we want to make a change, it will likely mean that we're going to have to look at the role that the financial sector plays in the UK. And of course, it is a massive part of our economy, but we are going to have to look at it. And if you think about it, the share buybacks that exist or the dividends that are paid out, all of these start to help the people who already own stocks and shares. And if you look at the analysis of who that is and through history, yet again, there is an inequality, and we start getting a concentration of wealth that is continued and amplified as we go further forward. So we need to try and change that. And I don't believe that we're going to have any long-lasting change until we start to look at the way our financial services sector functions. So let me give you another example. Now, if you look at people who want to go and get credit, what will happen is you will be given an interest rate, but not everybody gets the same rate. And there'll be people listening to this go, yes, Damien, because it's done on risk assessment. But what it actually means is that people on lower incomes disproportionately get worse products. So they may get a higher interest rate. In fact, this isn't just me saying this. The FCA did a report with Oxfam, and we'll link to it, that looked at the finance sector. And they concluded that disproportionately lower income families were given inferior products than their wealthier counterparts. And of course, as we've already described, that will disproportionately impact black people. So while they may be performing risk assessments in their own mind and therefore giving people a high interest rate, they are also amplifying the inequality that exists, because two people from different ethnic backgrounds could be lent money at different rates inadvertently. So if you imagine a world where I don't have the answers to this, but let's imagine if a lender or a bank had to publish the average interest rate on lending that they gave to their black customers, to their white customers, to their Asian customers. They had to break it down by ethnic minorities on the ethnicity of their customers. I would argue that very quickly having a visual information to understand the skew of what's going on in the financial services sector would be incredibly bad PR for those companies, and they would look to try and change that. And that's the problem. What we're doing in trying to educate people with this podcast is just shining a light on some of the facts that you won't know that are out there. And it's a system that you may not realize is quite so rigged against a certain portion of society. And so therefore, as people who benefit from it, they should be starting to raise questions as to why. And it may mean that a portion of the society that's benefited from cheaper interest rates might actually have to pay a bit more. But that's what equality is. So if you go back to that race analogy, all you're doing is saying, yeah, let's get everybody more on the same line when they start this race, because if they don't, how are they ever going to get out of this trap that they're in? And that race analogy is quite nice, because if you think about it, life is a relay. So you're going to pass on your baton to your children, and then they will pass it on to their children. The problem is that the race is rigged, and it gets worse and worse as time goes on because it gets amplified.
So that's really interesting. I mean, we've talked about there, Damien, what the problem is. And in order to move forward, I guess what we've got to do is we've firstly got to accept that there is a problem. I suppose we can educate ourselves as well. But how do we move on? What's the next level? How do we impact change? What can we do?
I mean, I don't have the answers. So all I can do is just raise questions. I mean, the first thing is we've got to listen to people who are the ones who are adversely affected by the current situation. And that means in the financial services world, we need to start to listen more to black customers. We need to hear what they think about it and what will help them. And it may be that businesses will have to start treating their customers differently, but in a positive way. Now, I don't have all the answers, as I say. So I mentioned one earlier, perhaps companies will need to be a bit more open in terms of how their different customers are impacted and what products they do get and how they are different. But going forward, you just raises a few questions. That one of the questions that may be is unions and the power that they have, because over the years, the power that unions have has dropped. And if you go back in America, then the unions helped black people. You know, there's an article we linked to that has the title, Help Black People Move Towards the Middle Class. So unions are going to probably play a part going forward, because don't forget, unions have been instrumental in the past of improving conditions and improving the rights of low-paid workers. And again, that will be disproportionately black people, as we said. It will be to do with zero contract hours, about the gig economy. We have to look at that and how that impacts certain parts of our society. We will have to look at the idea of the stimulus that we give to the economy. Because as mentioned earlier, when we looked at the coronavirus, parts of the UK population were more adversely affected than others. And if you think about the stimulus measures that were created, there were people who were left behind. So we were seeing very early on headlines that started to suggest people like renters and people on 0-hour contracts were being almost left out. Well, if you listen to the beginning part of this podcast, you would have suddenly, a light bulb would go on to realise that that is disproportionately impacting black people, because fewer black households are owned by the occupier. So these sorts of things, that when we make decisions and when there are stimulus measures or when there are new tax measures, we have to look at them and start to think, how do they impact different parts of our society? And do they disproportionately impact parts of our society? Like we talked about earlier on, about the inheritance tax rules. Does that disproportionately favour a particular part of society? Does technology play a bigger part, because it democratises the system? It enables people to be included. And another thing is, do we need to start to change the way we look at the finish line? So going back to that piece where there was a race, if we look at people and value their achievements, but we currently value them differently as a society. As I mentioned earlier, if there were people with the same qualifications in the same job, but a black male was being paid less than a white male for the same thing. So why is that? And also, we look at the finish line and we value people and say that somebody must get a certain qualification or degree at a certain level. But if you go back to that race analogy, if they were starting on the 90-metre line and only travelled 10 metres to get that qualification, but somebody else ran the full 100-metre race and achieved that, surely that should be taken into account when we start to value people and value their input. and the value they have in the economy. I think that needs to be looked into as well. So I don't have all the answers, unfortunately. But going forward, I just want people to sort of understand the problem and start to reflect where they are in that world. And are they adding to the problem? And can they somehow try and make changes to try and fix this? Because obviously this is a world that most people have inherited, but we can change it. And the system can't continue as it is, because I've already said that it's amplifying the problem. It's caused the problem, it's amplifying it. So the message is that I hope people take from this podcast is that we support the Black Lives Matter movement. We really do. And it's important to us. And Money to the Masses is built on trying to treat everybody equally and challenge the inequality that exists by helping people to build wealth, to help people get the education they need. And fundamentally, it was built on the principle that the city wouldn't tell you anything unless you paid them for it. That information was kept. But of course, if you think about it, who was it kept by? And so we're challenging all of those inequalities. So hopefully people have enjoyed the podcast and we've helped people learn a bit more. Now, Andy's just going to finish on a quick piece, to be honest. I'm conscious of the time. We need to listen to more Black people and what they think. So Andy has sourced a couple of good podcasts that people might want to listen to so they can hear and continue that conversation.
Yeah, so I did a bit of research to try and find some good podcasts out there to support the Black Lives Matter movement and who have got a lot to say. There's a young lady by the name of Patricia Bright who has a good following on YouTube, Instagram, and she's got a really good podcast as well. The podcast is called Caught Off Guard, and Patricia talks to a number of guests about society, growing up, money, finance, mortgages, investing. So it is quite finance focused, and it's an interesting podcast. And like I say, she's got a really good YouTube channel as well. Another podcast that I really enjoyed, and I'm actually going through the back catalogue over the coming weeks. I do love a podcast, Damien. I'm glad you set me this task. Is a guy called Sam Sanders, and he's a guy who's got a podcast called It's Been a Minute. And again, he talks about a range of subjects about society, culture, race, religion, and economics. He's got a really great conversational style. He's a really likable guy. He's got a number of guests that come on and talk about broad-ranging subjects. Like I say, I'm using it as a bit of an education tool myself. So there's a couple of podcasts, Patricia Bright and Caught Off Guard, and Sam Sanders, It's Been a Minute. Have a little listen and see what you think. And if you've found any other podcasts that you think have been really instrumental in being able to explain what's going on at the moment in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement, in terms of finance, economics, then please do get in touch and let us know via the community group would be great. That's facebook.com/groups/money to the masses. And let's start the conversation, start sharing some knowledge.
So that is it for this week, Andy. As ever, if people want to get in touch, they can do. Damien@moneytothemasses.com is the email address. And obviously you can contact me via Twitter, Instagram and Facebook. Do join our Facebook group. So until next week.
Until next time.